Okay, moving on to part 5 of our commentary on Book 1 of the Summa Contra Gentiles. Let's move on to Chapter 7, that the truth of reason is not opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. St. Thomas gives a multitude of arguments for this. This is an especially important question in light of the context in which this book was written, namely to combat Arab Aristotelianism and perhaps just simply Islam as well. The idea that there might be two truths was sort of an idea that was popularized later on as belonging to this period, although, Thomistic scholars and historians of philosophy usually criticize the simplicity in which this is described, this double truth theory. But the main idea is that, Aristotle is the philosopher, and what he said was truth, and if it contradicts the faith, well, there's a truth on one level of natural philosophy and reason, there's a higher truth on another level. They're both to be accepted somehow, with perhaps one having precedence over the other in certain respects. This is associated with something called Latin Averroism. Whether anyone actually held this form of that doctrine is suspicious, but there certainly is the idea of there being a tension between what reason knows on its own and what faith teaches. I mean, you see this especially in modern philosophers such as Kierkegaard, but even in ancient philosophers like Tertullian. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, for instance? Kierkegaard says that in order for someone to encounter the paradox, which is the incarnation of God become man, the eternal become temporal, one has to literally put aside his reason and accept the paradox with the happy passion, he calls, which is faith. And his greatest example of this is, of course, Abraham having to absurdly sacrifice his son and accept that to go against what his natural moral reasoning would compel him to do or not do. And this is credited to him as righteousness. He ascends past the mere ethical consciousness to what Kierkegaard calls the religious consciousness. So, the idea of there being an intrinsic and perhaps ineradicable even tension, if not contradiction, between certain levels of truth is something that perhaps is a perennial problem in philosophy. But St. Thomas will have nothing of this. He says in paragraph 1, "For that with which the human reason is naturally endowed is clearly most true, so much so that it is impossible for us to think of such truths as false. Nor is it permissible to believe as false that which we hold by faith, since this is confirmed in a way that is so clearly divine." I mean, the fundamental principle here is truth cannot contradict truth because God is the author of all truth, both natural and supernatural. And, it's not as if only God's revelation has authority for human beings. St. Thomas says that, it is impossible for us to really think of something that is self-evident as false, for instance. And there are things that are naturally known by human reason to be demonstrably true. And once we recognize that truth, it would be a sin to be skeptical about it or to even contradict it, even in the light of a higher truth, okay? Even in the light of a higher command. We're not permitted to go against what we know to be true. Of course, the question that is begged a little bit by St. Thomas here is, what are precisely these truths that are demonstrably known and we can know them to be such? And how do we know they are that? Especially when different philosophers will agree and disagree on what is true, even on the most fundamental level. Famous disagreement is between St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas on whether or not the world has a beginning Not whether it has a beginning or not, which is known by the faith. Yes, it does. But whether that question can be known by reason as well. And on the disputed question on the eternity of the world, St. Thomas argues that it cannot be known by reason. Aristotle was right, in a sense, to posit the eternity of the world, even though he did posit a first prime mover. But this was not some prime mover who existed, in a sense, outside of time, who created the world from nothing, time included. Aristotle did not conclude to that. St. Thomas said that philosophy itself cannot conclude one way or the other whether creation had a beginning in time or was eternally sort of made. Bonaventure disagreed and thought that reason could know this. And so there you have an example. And honestly, I don't find St. Thomas's arguments obviously correct. I'm a Thomist, but St. Bonaventure has some good arguments there. So anyway, so that which we hold by faith as divinely revealed cannot be contrary to our natural knowledge because God is the author of all truth, both truth. Okay, and there's several other arguments St. Thomas gives here. I just want to read paragraph 7. From this, we evidently gather the following conclusion. Whatever arguments are brought forward against the doctrines of faith are conclusions incorrectly derived from the first and self-evident principles embedded in nature. So, when you're dealing with attacks, attempted refutations, criticisms of the dogmas of faith, one can contradict them, not because one could demonstrate the truths of the faith, but one can show that such assertions are not demonstrably true, self-evidently true, or obvious. Instead, they are positions incorrectly derived from those first self-evident principles that are known to be true naturally. So that's the first thing St. Thomas is asserting here. Secondly, such conclusions, namely the ones that contradict the faith, do not have the force of demonstration. They are arguments that are either probable or sophistical, and so there exists the possibility to answer them. So again, although one cannot demonstrate the truths of the faith, one can, in a sense, demonstrate those claims that are against the truths of the faith to be not true, or at least to be not necessarily the case. At least you can sow some doubt in the truth of heresies, apostasy, and contradictions to Catholic doctrine. Okay, part 6 coming up.